Would you remain standing as we read from the scriptures? Our reading today is from Exodus 3, verses 1 through 15. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Listen, that was some professional reading right there. That takes a skill set. Good morning. It's so good to be with you. If I haven't had the chance to meet you, my name is Phil. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here. And today, just so excited as we just launched the season of Lent, this Ash Wednesday, and now are moving in today. We get to look at this first lesson and invitation that we want to focus on as a church family out of the book of Exodus. And today I want to, my wife is in South Africa alongside Deanna Mason. Together they're teaching and just training both local pastors, missionaries, just the joy of being able to go. But it marks for me, today's, out of the last 23 days, we have not been together 17 of them. And I say that just so you'll feel bad for me. There's no other point. It is, but it's just I was thinking of just today, man, it's a day where I have a heart to just to see God meet us and move, and very much feel, as I'm sure you do on many days, where you're stepping into your roles, just the limitations of myself. So I want to pray, and I want to ask God to just to lead this morning, very aware of how much I need him. Jesus, we just, as a church family, love you. God, and as just one of the pastors of this community, it is my desire to serve you and to serve your people so faithfully. And God, I'm coming with what feels like my best and what feels like my best that is very inadequate. And so I just ask that you would just do what only you can do, Lord, because this is more of the true story. It's always your sufficiency and never any of ours. And I just ask that you would illuminate your word, that your spirit would be with us, and that you would lead us to your heart. We love you and we honor you in Jesus' name. Amen. Today, we get a look at one of the most just famous and epic stories in the whole entirety of Scripture, the encounter of Moses in the burning bush out of Exodus 3. And admittedly, when I was preparing for this teaching and beginning to write through it, I couldn't shake the desire to watch The Prince of Egypt, and it was remarkable. I was this close to showing the clip of this moment from that movie because it is amazing, and I just realized that I would run out of time. But let me just tell you, I'm convinced this is the greatest biblical cartoon ever created, and if you haven't seen it or it's been a long time, go watch it. Homework is go watch The Prince of Egypt. It holds up. You'll cry. At least I did. So I just, it was really fun. But you remember that movie in this moment. I mean, it captures something about it. Just Moses, the shepherd on the hillsides of Midian. And he, in that place, has this encounter with this bush and the nature of the fire that doesn't consume it. And he's drawn in, even the way the artistry captures the feeling or the essence of being in the presence of God. It's really quite stunning and beautiful. But as we lean towards this story this morning, there's this invitation, this lesson about the holiness of God that I think is an anchor, not only of understanding the book of Exodus or understanding the distinct things that the Spirit of God is teaching us in this season, but this moment of Moses in the burning bush is an anchor of our entire faith. That when you look at the lessons that are told in this story of Moses encountering God through the burning bush, there is a plumb line of what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what we believe about the nature of God. And today, more than anything else, what I want to invite you into as we walk through the story and it ultimately comes to a place of invitation, is my heart is simply for us to see this truth. That when you see God for who he really is, he will show you who you really are. And I think we have to just understand this, that every single person in this room, we by default are on a journey about understanding ourselves. Who am I? What was I made for? What has God created me to do? Do I believe? It doesn't matter where you're at on the journey. Every single one of us starts from the orientation of who am I really? How do I live into the fullness of who I've been created to be? What is my future? What was I made for? What is the identity? Above all things, who am I? And it's not even an inherent selfishness, though we have to admit it lives in a self-centered reality because it's by default the nature of every single human being. When we navigate our own lives, the questions we're asking at the forefront are about ourselves. Who am I? And what is my life really about? And what we have to see profoundly communicated, not only in this story, but the rest of the gospel, the entire narrative of Scripture, is that the invitation is actually that first and foremost, we have to know who God is. And it is only by knowing who he is that we will understand who we are. That somehow the exchange that's in front of us is in every tendency that's asking a question about the orientation of our lives around ourselves is to come to the place where we say, there is someone else and all life actually orients itself around it. And my goal is not to know myself first. My goal is to know him first. And by knowing him first, that he will teach me who I am. And I believe this, at the heart of the Christian faith is this countercultural conviction that our first and primary pursuit is to know God above all else. Friends, this is not like the thing to say because this moment of the church is we're talking about pursuing God and intimacy with God. It's not like this cultural preference. It's not like my favorite brand of Christianity or the hot thing to talk about. I want to just remind you that at the anchor of the historic global faith, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, is a central guiding conviction that must be in our lives. We are a people who pursue God first. That is what we were made to do. And it is when we have an unshakable conviction about the pursuit of God that we will begin to be able to answer all of the other significant questions that matter quite deeply about who we are and who he has made us to be. But even to see this in the story, we have to get the vision of where this moment comes from. And many of us familiar with the life and the story of Moses here. The people of Israel are enslaved under Pharaoh in Egypt, and it's here that Moses, as the Pharaoh is murdering all of the children of a certain age, fearful of how the Israelites have grown stronger in the land, begins to move in this great evil of destruction. But there's this one child by his mother, by his sister, who gets pulled out and in this miraculous vision. By the way, sometimes when we read the miraculous stories of the Bible, we have this instant reaction of like, did it really happen like that? Can I just invite you that every single vision of our life, every single conviction that we hold to is based on a belief that God does miraculous things. And so I just want to encourage you, not only did God do miraculous things in the life of Moses, he's doing miraculous things in your life. And I would encourage you to widen your eyes from skepticism to wonder, because I think it's part of what Jesus is trying to teach us. But this child who by edict should have been killed, now rescued and raised in Pharaoh's household, we don't really know the fullness of what that looked like or what it meant, but we see this, that there is this Hebrew child saved and rescued by the miraculous power of God, now raised within this royal family. But at some point, aware of his heritage, aware of his story, he's seeing the oppression of his people. In his anger and in his frustration, he kills one of the Egyptian leaders that he saw in those moments of suffering around his own people, the Hebrew people. And in fear, after murdering the man, he flees, he runs away. This child that was rescued, raised in a royal family, this dual identity, misplaced in all that he does, now finds himself on the run, has an encounter with these stories and these people and this family in Midian, and next thing you know, Moses has run away from his life, aware of the complexity of his story, aware of the depths of his evil, and he's hiding as a shepherd on the skirts of Midian. A man with a displaced identity asking a question, who am I really? There's more in Moses' story that's connected to our story than we often realize. I mean, in essence, without some of the just unique nature of Moses' story, this was mine. A runaway son, uncertain of who he really was, trying to find his identity and his own power, became very aware of his brokenness, foolishness, and propensity to darkness. Just wanted to hide and numb because I just wanted to know who I was, but I had no idea how to get there. I think many of us know those kind of displaced stories. Many of us have had seasons or find ourselves in seasons where we feel like we're running from an identity we don't know how to hold because we don't actually know the identity that we are called to run towards. That is where this story is established. And that is part of the heart of what God wants to speak to us. And it's even in that place, the reminder of going in our stories, in all of our displaced identities, there is nothing that will answer it but rightly knowing the one who made us. This is the exchange. What will get my one great pursuit? Knowing me or knowing him? And that is the question that we have to respond to in this season. And this passage, more than anything else, it kind of reveals three things. It tells us lots of different truths, but I believe that here in Exodus 3, we see a revelation of the nature of God, the name of God, and the desire of God. As Pastor Emily read the passage, oh, by the way, can we just stop? Last week, Pastor Emily gave a remarkable teaching. Can we honor her and just say thank you? Such a gift to us as a church. But this, as we look at the beginning of this story, we see Moses tending his flock on the side of the mountain. And suddenly there's this, angel of the Lord appears in flames of fire from the bush. And on the surface level, when we look at that, like we kind of heard this many times, that we think the burning bush in and of itself is kind of the miraculous picture, although it wasn't. In ancient Israel or in Israel today, like in the desert regions, it gets real hot. And the idea of a bush that's just basically dead and dry, don't think of a bush like with tons of leaves on it. You got to think of it like a stump of a bush that had one season with a little bit of green and it's just super dry. They've been known quite many times to just burst into flames. So what's interesting when you think about this, it's not that Moses is walking by and is like, oh my gosh, there's a bush on fire, right? That was not surprising to him. That was actually something he probably saw on several different occasions many times. But what he noticed was not just simply that the bush was on fire, but that while it was on fire, it was not being consumed. And he looked at this thing and he began to go, there's something different about this. I just think it's important for us because in our own lives, I think we all carry this mentality to some degree. It's like, well, God, if you showed up like a burning bush, if you showed up in my car right now, if you showed up in my workplace right now, if you showed up at my dinner table right now, if like you showed up in a demonstration of your undeniable power, of course I would do what I was asking you to do. But we take that from a false place because what we have to see is that what Moses was actually doing in the midst of something ordinary, he had the eyes to see something extraordinary. In the natural, he actually had the ability to pause long enough to go, I think something supernatural is happening in the midst of this. And I think so often we become blind to this idea like, God, if you're gonna move, it's gonna be this disorientation from real life, so extreme that you're gonna catch my attention. Let me just tell you what the Bible would actually invite us into, what I've learned in my life, and I think many of you have. Often the most supernatural invitations are first framed in something quite ordinary. And we have to become a people who learn how to move towards the things of God, to have our attention captive by wonder. It's wonder that moves Moses. It's not that it's obviously something out of the ordinary. It's that little place. This is why we talk about this a lot, why we have to allow God to restore innocence in our hearts. Because if you can't look at something ordinary with the possibility of wonder, I don't know if you'll always hear the moments that God's calling. But we see that in Moses. But it also tells us something like this moment happens, but Moses has to move towards the burning bush. And again, there's this profound lesson. It's the mirage of pursuing God like it's all up to us. But I've learned this about the character and nature of God. He'll do the 98%, but then it's almost like the very last leg he'll leave up to you. God is showing up in a burning bush to the side of Moses, requiring Moses to have to make the choice to walk to it, to move towards it. And I just want us to see this. God will always reveal himself in a way that still requires us to choose pursuing him. It's not that he's the one ultimately pursuing us. He is. But as God pursues us, very rarely will he show up right in front of us. He'll show up just enough to the side that it requires us to actually begin to move towards him. Why does he do that? Because I think transformation is found in the pursuit of God as much as it is found in the encounter with God. And if we aren't willing to be a people who learn how to pursue him, then we're going to miss the lessons that he's trying to teach us. Let me give you a comparative example out of my own life. I am currently have been trying to lose weight. I'm currently down about 22 pounds. Well done, me. But this is if you've been at the church long enough, you know this is a systematic thing. I'm basically, my love language is donuts. Stress plus donuts means my weight fluctuates, right? And there are like these moments. Usually they're after some trip, and I look at a picture of myself. And I'm like, oh gosh. And but really, for me in this season, I'm in my 40s. I'm like, I just need to be healthy. I'm like that mentality shift is changing inside of me. And so I've been going after it. But what happens, the few times I've tried like getting healthy, eating healthy, all of those things, seriously, what will happen is the first little bit of weight just drops so quickly. I'm not saying it's easy, but if I fully give myself to it, for me, it's pretty wild how quick that first little bit comes off. But then there's this point, the point I'm at right now, where I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm living in the same discipline. I'm like moving my life towards health. I'm like really contending and trying. And no matter what I do, for weeks, I will stay at the exact same weight. It's like my body, and I've read into it a little bit. I don't pretend that I know a ton of, but it's like my body is clinging to this weight, and it is saying, you will not get past this. I like this weight. I like this. This is security for me. This little bit of extra means we're going to be okay. Like my body is staunchly holding on to this weight. I'm at a plateau. And what has to happen is because this is the point. This is the point. This is the point where historically, either this one or the next one, where you're just like, man, donuts are a lot better than this, right? For me, they are. But it's that moment because this is what you have to understand, that the real lesson of health has to be found in the plateau. Because it's in the invitation to a change of thinking, a change of understanding. It's the place where I'm like, I'm not doing this. And maybe seasons of my life where I was more insecure about my own sense of self or my ego or how I would look in front of people. The ultimate motivation behind it couldn't withstand the testing of the plateau. But when the driving heart is like, I just want to be whole. I just want to be healthy. There's this thing that I'm realizing in this plateau, like I have to contend here. And it's the lessons in the contending that are teaching me about true transformation. So thank you for indulging my, vulnerable moment. But I think the lesson's the same. There's this place in pursuing God. I think many of us are here, by the way. It's like, man, the way I pursued God in the last season, the way I would wake up, the way I'd pray, the way I'd read my word, the way I'd go to church, and the way I felt deep intimacy with God in those seasons, it's like I'm doing all the same stuff, but where is he? Feels so distant, feels so foreign, feels like I don't know what I'm doing, like maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. And I'm telling you, this is what we have to understand. There are moments in life where God in his goodness will hide himself just a little bit, not because he isn't after you and not that the deepest desire of his heart is intimacy, but he knows that there's lessons in the contending. This is the invitation, friends, that we have to reclaim in this season. This is why we've been talking about this in some way as a theme throughout the entire last part of this season, that as a family, as a community of followers of Jesus, that are setting our sights on pursuing God, that our pursuit of God in some ways has been molded by, man, when it's easy, when it's good, when it's hype, when it's just fun, when the presence of God is in power, there's a pursuit we have of him. But I'm telling you, how will we pursue him at the plateau? That's what God is inviting us into. It's a leaning in that I am a person who pursues God, not because it's easy, not because I get benefits from it, but it's because I'm who I really am. My entire life only makes sense when I know him. I can only know me by knowing him. And this is the revelation that comes to Moses and the revelation that's being invited to us. And I love that even as Moses moves towards him, and we hear later in the story, Moses is like, hey, I don't know your name. Who are you? But I love that when Moses doesn't know God's name, God knows his. And I just want to remind you that there are many seasons where you'll be like, God, who are you? And I just want to remind you that in every place where you have a displaced understanding of him or you have the God who knows your name. He knows your name, and he has been seeking you and inviting you into this invitation of who he really is. The scriptures say that God says, do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. When you look at how theologians throughout history look at this passage, it's very significant. They actually call this Moses' conversion experience. That in essence, prior to this, Moses knew God, believed in God, had an awareness that there was a God of the Hebrews, but he knew about him, but it's here that he knows him. It's this invitation into what God wants to do in our lives, this place where so many times we get satisfied with the knowing about. But can I just tell you, God is not satisfied with you knowing about him. God is inviting you to know him. An experiential knowing, and this is the revelation of his nature. These two things reveal, like these are these cornerstones of revealing his nature. The first is that he represents himself through fire, and the second is this reality of his holiness. He says to Moses, take off your sandals, for this place is holy. God could have represented himself to Moses and the people of Israel any way he wanted to, but he chooses fire. This fire that stays and doesn't consume. I actually think there's a lot of meaning in it. Because when you think about fire, it communicates something. You can look at fire, you can intellectually see it, you can intellectually understand it. You're like, there's fire right there. But then there's this place where you get near it and it's different. You begin to feel its warmth on your face. You can smell its smoke in your clothes. You can actually feel and hear the crackling of the fire underneath it. It's an invitation. God as fire is a statement that this isn't a God that simply exists. This is a God that can be known. It's different. God is a God who can be experienced and known. It also communicates the nature of God. Let me just tell you, bound in the picture of the fire, I remember a lesson I heard from Timothy Keller many, many years ago on this. It's always stayed with me, where he talked about how the fire itself is a demonstration that we have to understand that God is both beautiful and severe. Like real fire, something you can't live without, and yet if you get too near it, something that will kill you. It's almost a statement of this reality of God, that we long for him, we were made for him, and yet there is something about him that we actually, if we got the fullness of him, we could not even live through it. This is Moses later in the story. He says, God, I want to see your glory. And God, I don't think being metaphorical at all, looks at Moses and goes, Moses, if I showed you the fullness of my glory, it would kill you. Like God is something other than us. He is different and bound in his nature. Communicating in the fire is not only that he's a God that can be understood, but he's a God who can be experienced, but he's a God of profound beauty and worth and meaning, and yet a God of power and danger. Like he's a something else. But I think for us, it's this place of knowing that whatever God is, he is different than me. I think we all know this temptation. This temptation exists in our lives, in our culture. It exists in every culture. We, by that thing that wants to orient our lives around ourselves, we have this way of saying, God, I want you to be like this. Well, I believe in God, but I believe in a God who wouldn't or is or should or will. Can I just tell you, we have to receive the lesson of Exodus 3. If God is, you have no authority to tell him how he is. He just simply is, and however he is, he is. And rather than us trying to define God on our preferences, we must yet again learn to receive God in his nature. And it's here that he displays in his nature that he is holy. He is holy. He tells Moses to take off his sandals because the holiness of God is present. And I just tell you, I've learned this. It's only when we know God is holy that we can begin to know him for who he really is. It's the core of his nature. I think as Christians, it's interesting to me that the one part of God we want to know the least, I think, is the only part of God that can help us understand the rest. His holiness is actually what tells us everything about him. Later on in the passage, we're going to see the radical compassion of God, the God who hears his people, the God who moves towards deliverance, the God of rescue, the God who loves people. And we almost are like, well, God is holy and compassionate. No, God is holy, and compassion is an aspect of his holiness, because his holiness is his otherness. There is a God, and he is not like us. There is a God, and he is separate. He is different. He is set apart from us. The revelation of knowing God is actually first and foremost found in understanding that whoever this God is, he is holy. He is other. He's really set apart. And then you hear it in the response. Moses is afraid. He's afraid. He hides his face from God. In my own life, I know this. I've been part of our church. There's this, my own story of coming back to Christ, a prodigal, really at a low place in my life, college in Southern California, find myself at this worship gathering in a hotel in Anaheim, and just so broken in my life, so tired, like the weight of lies just like were overwhelming me, and I just began to break. I remember worship ending, and I was just was confused. And so I left and I went into this room, and I started laying on the ground. I was weeping. I was just in this tiny side room by myself. And suddenly I just knew I was in the presence of God. I don't know how to tell you I knew. I had known his presence when I was a child. I don't have any other way to tell you, but it was just suddenly an awareness that I was not the only person in the room. This moment was the single greatest transformation of my life. It was an encounter with the grace of God. It was an encounter with the Father heart of God. I had never experienced this kind of love in my life, but that's not where it started. You want to know where it started? I was terrified. Because suddenly, as I realized I was in the presence of God, all of these emotions rose to the surface: anger, frustration, condemnation, shame. But the one that stood the most was the realization of how much I had failed him, Like I was aware I was in the presence of the God who was faithful and I was unfaithful, and I was terrified of what it meant to be in his presence. Even the deep sense of longing to turn my heart back to him was this feeling like, God, how much is it going to cost? How deep is it going to hurt? Because all I could think about was how desperately I had failed God. I remember in that place trying to process through this. And the words of God where he spoke to my heart, tell me what you've done that I can't undo. And I remember saying everything. Like everything, you can't undo all that I've done. And because what I also understood was not just that I was something unholy in the presence of something that was holy. I knew he was inviting me back to him. And I knew it meant that I couldn't just leave the same person that walked into that room. Like I felt the severity of it. If I was going to give my heart back to him, it meant I had to try to figure out how to give him all of me. Because the encounter that changed my life was the holiness of God. How in it, his mercy, his love, his faithfulness, it changed every part of my life. But I want to just tell you, we have to reclaim being a people who find his holiness again, his otherness. Because it's actually in seeing who he really is, not who we wish he was, not the transformed way we want him to be to justify ourselves. It's when we see him for who he really is that everything begins to change in our life. And the story, though, continues. It says, the Lord said, I've seen the misery of my people. Like we discover the heart of God for deliverance, for transformation, for freedom. And I just want to remind you, this is who God is. He is the God who delivers. He is the God who saves. He is the God who rescues. He is the God who hears the cries of his people. He is the God who moves towards injustice. He is the God whose throne is established on justice. And he is the God who sees suffering and cares. He moves towards people who are hurting, and he brings transformation and power. But he does so based on his ability to see what is true and right. But this is the wild part. In the midst of here, Moses, aware of the holiness of God, aware of his lack of holiness, in the midst of the compassion of God, this is God's response. He looks at Moses and goes, I'm sending you. I'm sending you. This is the mystery of God I will never fully understand. That as he looks out and sees the brokenness of the world, he chooses to use people like us for the purposes of his redemption. It was true of Moses, and it's true in this room. Do you know every grief of God for the city of Atlanta? His plan is you and me and us. God has not stopped picking unholy people to partner to do the transforming work of redemption in this world. I think that's part of the invitation of the season that we're in. That God chooses us. And even the picture, by the way, I think it's really interesting when Moses takes his sandals off. When you look at that story, I think the common kind of thought is that in ancient culture, which is true, that you kind of saw feet as like the dirtiest part of you, or the most unclean part of you. So it was a statement of humility. And it certainly was. But when you look at all the stories of covenants in the Old Testament, you're going to find a really interesting thing. A lot of them have to do with taking off or changing shoes. Abraham takes off a sandal. There's all these, like you look at Ruth, look at Boaz, look at all these stories of what happens. And actually symbolically, because it's a picture in some ways that represents yourself. When you went into a moment of covenant and you took off both of your shoes, what you were saying was that you recognized that the other person held all authority and you held none. That the other person had every right to make a decision and you had none. It was a statement of recognizing that you were in every way dependent on the other person you were making covenant with. I just put that picture in front of you. When Moses responds to the holiness of God, he takes off his shoes, and it's a way as if he's saying, I have no claim to negotiate here. I recognize whom I'm in the presence of. It's a statement of radical honor. And Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. And then Moses said to go, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what's his name? Then what should I tell them? And then God responds, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. This fascinating moment of the name of God, Yahweh in Hebrew, and it's this really difficult phrase to try to translate. And I think I am who I am captures the essence of it. But I would say, I think what if we were looking at the Hebrew most literally, what God is saying is he goes, my name is being. It's like he was saying to Moses, tell them that being itself has sent you. Actually, the revelation in the name of God is the revelation of this reality that God was, there is no was. He's not defined by will be. He is. It's a statement that it's actually his being that defines our being. His existence defines our existence. The nature of God, our was, is, and is to come, is defined by his being and the permanence of the reality of who he is. It's a statement of the radical nature of God, the character of God, the wild understanding of God, that God simply always was, but it's more of us an invitation to go, what is the center of your world? What is the invitation that you actually define your life around? Because this is the exchange being offered to Moses, and this is the exchange being offered to us. Who is at the center of your existence? You or God? Because the true story, what God is communicating to Moses is saying, Moses, I am real existence, and your existence is wrapped around my existence. So the question is, are you going to define your life and your story orchestrated and centered around me, or are you going to define your story orchestrated and centered around you? And let me remind you that life does not revolve around you, Moses. Being itself revolves around me. Who am I? I am being itself. I am existence. I am that I am, and you are what you are because I am what I am. I think sometimes, can I just slow down and say, I think we believe it, but we don't orchestrate our lives like we believe it. Let me put the humility in front of you. Even this season in my life, it's like, man, I'm feeling lots of things. I feel like I've thought this season would be a little bit different than it is. I feel like I'm really contending for things that feel harder than they are. I was on the phone with one of my friends who's another senior pastor. He's like, man, sometimes I feel like I've lost the ability to know how to lead a church into fruitfulness. Like I'm just like wrestling, not just the reality of like, man, I feel, and I just am reminded, I just had to come into like pretty significant repentance this week and be like, oh God, as if anything about this life or this church or this family that I care about is actually up to my capabilities. How long ago did I believe it and I don't even see that I believe it? Like, God, you are the center. You are the author of your church. You are the head of your church. You are the perfecter of faith. You are the one who's in charge. Everything is dependent on you. God, I'm just so sorry that I so easily convinced myself that somehow everything is dependent on me. Y'all, it's not dependent on us. We have a part to play. I don't minimize that. But my life has to be centered around the one that is being, because I am not, nor are you. All of my existence is because there is one who has always existed. Linz and team, you can come up. God is the true center of our stories. All worry, anxiety that plagues our life is that place where we are so convinced we're the center of our own stories. But I think the invitation is to know God and to exchange who's at the center of our universe. And of course, through this, we see this last part, the nature of God and the name of God, but we see the desire of God, which is that he's ascending God. It's as Moses sees rightly about who God is, that God begins to reveal to Moses who he really is. And it's the reality that once you see that God is set apart, he'll start to talk to you about how you're set apart. And sending is the nature of being set apart. This isn't just true for Moses. Let me remind you, Jesus looked at his disciples and said, as the Father has sent me, so now I sent you. Every single person in this room is a sent one. My guess is most of us probably believe that somehow theologically. So it begs the question then, why is it so hard to find experientially? If sentness has nothing to do with vocation, if you're as sent as I am, as Lynn's is, or as anyone else in this room, if our sentness is part of our identity because we've been set apart by God for a task and a purpose of partnering with him for the reconciliation of the world, then why is that sentness so hard to move towards? Why is that identity so difficult to find ourselves in? And I think we see this here in the story of Moses, but can I just land on my final point and then my invitation? Isn't it interesting that this story starts with a runaway murderer shepherd, and it ends with a commissioned son sent with a calling, and the bridge in the middle was the pursuit of God and an encounter with the holiness of God. And this is the YWAMer that will always live in me, but it's just the truest statement I've ever heard. You were made to know God and to make him known. Let me tell you why you exist. You were made to know God and to make him known. But one comes before the other. You can't be partnered with God to make him known if you don't know him. And I'm telling you guys, God does not want churches that know about Jesus to try to help Atlanta know about Jesus. God is trying to move in his church that those who would know him like fire on their face and smoke in their clothes. And I got a little too close and I was a little too flippant. And so I've learned how to be in the presence of this otherly God because I'm starting to know him. That then in that place, there's a commissioning, a sending. This is the heart of God for his church in this hour, that we would be a people who would make him known. But God is not letting us get out of the desert until we learn the lesson that we are a people who first and foremost have to know him. We have to know him. That is the whole story. That Moses would know him to know himself, and that to know him to make him known. Moses, we read these two pushbacks. In chapter 4, we see these two others. As God places this calling on Moses, his first response is like, who am I, right? Come on, God. I think you picked the wrong person. Who am I? I know who I am. And I think you're asking the wrong person. Moses' first place of uncertainty or insecurity is that he is not worthy. But then the second question is like, but who are you? I don't know you well enough. You're asking me to do something and I don't know you well enough. I'm not capable of doing this. I think this is one of the things that plagues us all the time. We feel this deep sense of calling, or these moments where God moves in our lives, but then we're like, I don't know you well enough, God. I don't know how to do this. And we're like, you have to have a seminary degree to do this. We have to be more equipped to do this. And I'm not somebody who's pushing down on effective training, but I'm just here to tell you that moment that says, I can't do this because I don't know enough about you, is part of the pushback of every human soul. The next is the one I think a lot of us feel too. Moses says, but what if the people don't believe me? The what ifs. But God, what if I can't? What if you don't? What if they respond this way? What if they say this? What if they learn about my past? How many of us have to actually get to the place in our own understanding of who God is? We first ask God, but who am I? And then we ask, but who are you? But then we have to get to the place of, but what if? You know that place. I know that place. What if I step out, God, and you don't meet me? What if I try and I fail? What if I believe you for miraculous power and you don't show up? What if, God? But then the last one, I think, is the core of all of them. Moses goes, yeah, but God, I'm not good at this. Like I don't talk well. I stutter and my speech is ineffective. Like, you've picked the wrong person. It's in the narrative. This is where God actually, there's a frustration. You see the power and the anger of God, and he responds back to Moses. And this is where you have to go watch this in The Prince of Egypt, probably the best part of the entire movie. Right? But he goes, enforce Moses. Who made man's mouth? Who made the seeing or the blind, or the speaking or the mute? Who is the real authority, Moses? And it's here that he pushes back. And I want you to see this, that these are the places that our calling stalls. as we pursue God and we have this sense and we're trying to wrestle through it, we always ask, who am I? Who are you? But what if, but I am not? And fascinating enough, not one of those moments when God responds to Moses, does he in any way encourage Moses based on Moses. When Moses goes, but who am I? God doesn't look at Moses and go, oh, come on, Moses, you're awesome. You're really awesome. By the way, I think God thought he was awesome. He looks at Moses and scriptures call him his best friend. I think God liked Moses. But that's not his encouragement to Moses' insecurity about himself. What is his encouragement? I'll go with you, Moses. You don't have to be sufficient. I'm sufficient. But I don't know enough about you. It's okay, Moses. You know, I'm the God who, when your father told me that, I was enough for him too. When your father Abraham said, I don't know you well enough, I was enough for him. When your father Isaac said, I don't know you enough, I was enough for him. When your father Jacob said, I don't know you well enough, I am the God who's enough for you, Moses. But what if God, the people don't believe me? Moses, what do you have in your hand? That stick? Okay, I can make that stick enough. You don't have to, I will meet you. What you have is enough because you have me, Moses. But God, I can't. And this is where God says, Moses, stop telling me you can't. I know you can't. That is not the invitation, Moses. You can't. I can. And the invitation to understand who I've made you to be is not to trust your own sufficiency. It's to trust that I am capable. And I think this is what God is after in our lives, what we can only learn in pursuit of him, in desert seasons, in contending in dry places, that the invitation at the heart of God is not how sufficient you can become. It's learning to lean into the sufficiency of Jesus. That my calling rests on him. My sentness rests on him. What God has asked me to do rests on him. I do not have the skills or the equation or the talents or the giftedness or the heart or the holiness to offer. You want to know what I have? I have him. Well, wherever I go, the presence of God goes with me. That whatever God asks me to do, he is enough for me. That in all of my incapabilities, he is capable. In all of my lacking, he is enough for me. And in every what if scenario, God is sufficient. His blood is sufficient. The cross is sufficient. The gospel is sufficient. I'm righteous because he's righteous. I'm holy because he's holy. I'm capable because he's capable. And the invitation is not to find out how you can do this. It's just to start to learn that this is the mystery of God. He really likes and loves broken people like us. And he meets us where we are. And so I just say to you that it's time that we anchor ourselves in the calling of God. You are sent. And you have to allow the Spirit of God to minister to all of the places where you feel that pushback. I feel that pushback. Guys, this week I felt that pushback. I am a nonstop runaway son trying to trust the God who adopted me. So I just invite you in. It is him and him alone. And we have to receive from him. Friends, would you stand? I have to close. And I've asked Linz and the team just for a couple of minutes to invite us into a response. Can I just ask that if you identify with any of those four things that you've been wrestling through, there's this tension inside of your soul, would you just ask Jesus to meet you there? We're just gonna worship for a moment, then I'm gonna close our service and I'll invite our prayer teams forward. But God, we're here. We really need you. I really need you. God, I'm sorry I so desperately wanna be enough. I really wanna be enough. Would you release us, God, from the brokenness that so lies about the gospel? Lord, thank you that you're enough for me. You're enough for me. You're enough for us. We receive you now in Jesus' name.